In the business world, there's a very fine line between driving a hard bargain and using illegal pressure. Today, we're going to explore exactly where that line is, all through a landmark court case that pretty much changed the whole game. Okay, let's dive right in. I want you to just imagine for a second that you're running a small business. Now, your biggest client, the one you totally depend on, comes to you with a brand new contract. The thing is, the terms are just awful. They're going to gut your profits. But there's this unspoken threat hanging in the air. Sign it or we walk, and you're out of business tomorrow. So what do?
That feeling, right? That feeling of being completely trapped. That brings us to the big question for today. Think of it this way. Say your pipes burst at home. You call the plumber, they give you a price. But once they've shut off your main water line and your basement's starting to flood, they suddenly double that price. Is that just smart business or is it pure exploitation?
Well, that's exactly where the law can step in. To handle these kinds of high-pressure, back-against-the-wall situations, contract law came up with a very specific tool. It's called the doctrine of economic duress, and it's basically designed to be a shield for the little guy. So, what is it, really? Well, economic duress is what happens when one side puts so much illegitimate pressure on the other that they're basically forced into a deal. The key ingredients here are that feeling of coercion, like your free will has just been taken out of the equation, and the fact that you literally have no other reasonable choice but to cave. So, how does a court figure out if it's actually duress? Well, traditionally, they've got a kind of three-point checklist. First, was there an illegitimate threat? Second, did that threat cause you to sign the contract? And third, was there any other reasonable way out for you? Seems simple enough, right? But a recent case threw a huge wrench into that very first step. And that brings us to our real-world showdown, the story of a small travel agency, Times Travel, going up against the massive, state-owned Pakistan International Airlines, or PIA for short. And this was a classic David versus Goliath scenario. Times Travel was a small, family-run business, and their entire operation depended on selling tickets for PIA. Why? Because PIA was the only airline flying direct routes to Pakistan from the UK at the time. That gave PIA all the power. So here's where the trouble started. PIA suddenly slashed the commissions they were paying the travel agents. Times Travel and some others sued to get the money they were rightfully owed. So, PIA played its ultimate trump card. They offered a new contract, but it came with an absolutely brutal condition. To get the new deal, Times Travel had to drop its lawsuit for all the unpaid cash. The message was clear: forget about the money we already owe you, or we will destroy your business. Feeling like they had a gun to their head, Times Travel signed. But later, they sued, arguing they only agreed because of economic duress. This was not a simple open and shut case, though. It was a genuine legal puzzle, one that ended up going all the way to the United Kingdom's Supreme Court. And this just shows you why the Supreme Court had to get involved. The lower courts couldn't agree at all. First, the High Court sided with the airline. Then, the Court of Appeals sided with the travel agent. It was a total mess, and it was up to the highest court in the land to finally sort it out. Okay, and here it is. This is the fascinating, mind-bending twist at the heart of this entire case. PIA's threat wasn't to do something illegal. Their threat was to do something they had every legal right to do. Simply choose not to offer Times Travel a new contract, right? You can't force a company to do business with you. So the giant question became, how can a lawful act be considered illegitimate pressure? This question forced the Supreme Court to grapple with a really tough concept, one that gets right to the soul of what contract law is all about. Can you use something you're allowed to do as a weapon to force someone into a horribly unfair deal? This is the tricky world of what lawyers call lawful act duress. So I'm going to throw it to you. What do you think? If the threat on the table is something you're perfectly entitled to do by the letter of the law, can it still cross that line? Can it become the kind of illegitimate pressure that the law should protect people from? The entire business world was holding its breath for this answer. Now, the court did not take this lightly at all. You can see from this quote from the judgment just how carefully they were treading. They knew that courts jumping into private business deals is a big step, and they said that finding this kind of duress from a lawful act should be, and I quote, a rare occasion. But after all of that careful thought, all that caution, the court's answer to that huge critical question was a clear, powerful, unambiguous Yes. Yes, a lawful act can, in the right circumstances, absolutely count as illegitimate pressure. So what are those circumstances? The court laid out a new standard. They said a lawful threat crosses the line if the demand it's attached to is made in bad faith. In Pia's case, the court felt they weren't just negotiating hard. They were knowingly using Times Travel's vulnerability to force them to give up a claim, which the court found to be, and this is the key word, unconscionable. All right, so the legal drama is over. But what's the bottom line here? What does this high-minded legal ruling actually mean for businesses out there making deals and signing contracts right now? It's a really big deal, actually. For starters, it offers a new layer of protection for smaller businesses against being exploited by huge, dominant players. It also sends a clear message that even hard bargaining has legal and, frankly, moral limits. It confirms that the law can and will step in when a deal just feels morally wrong, and it sets a huge new precedent for fairness and contract law. If you take one thing away from this whole story, let it be this. The law has evolved. It can now look behind the curtain of what is technically legal to judge whether someone's business conduct is just shrewd or if it's fundamentally exploitative. It's a major step towards recognizing a standard of commercial morality. And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. This ruling definitely pushed the boundary forward, but it also opened up a whole new debate. In the rough and tumble world of commerce, where exactly should the law draw that line between a clever, advantageous deal and one that's just plain wrong? That's a question every single one of us in business now has to consider.